First of all, thank you everyone for joining this session. It's a dream come true to have our ex-president, Michelle Bachelet, here tonight. So we will stand around for applause. We are a full room full of students, exciting students, full of exciting women, Latin American, and from all around the world here with us tonight to hear you. And thank you so much, Professor Francesco, for joining us as a chair here in the session. We're going to discuss about human rights. We're going to discuss about the Latin America situation. And thank you everyone for joining. And we can start right now. So please, Francesco.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, clear and well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. So I was telling Michelle Bachelet a few moments ago, I had the honor of chairing a public conference of the then President of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, in her previous visit to the LSE some years ago. And it is again a special honor and privilege to chair this conference and introduce her to the audience. Also, I don't think she needs any introduction, but here we go. Michelle Bachelet, professionally, is a trained pediatrician who earned a medical degree from the University of Chile. In her public life, she had a long political career in her country and served as the President of Chile from 2006 to 2010, and again from 2014 to 2018. During her presidency, President Bachelet implemented significant social policies, including the introduction of free education for low-income students and the establishment of a national social security system. She also introduces legislation to expand women's rights and combat domestic violence. After leaving office, La Señora Bachelet went to serve as Executive Director of UN Women and then as the first Under-Secretary General and inaugural Executive Director of the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. In 2018, she assumed the role as the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights. The title of our conference today is the Human Rights Status and Challenges in Latin America. Señora Bachelet, President Bachelet, I'm not sure how to address you. Welcome to the LSE.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody hears me well.
Yes,
yes, fantastic. I will go ahead then. Well, thank you for this invitation to talk about the challenges facing our countries. This is an invitation at a distance in kilometers. I'm in Santiago right now, but very close to our interest in contributing to making the lives of our compatriots fairer and fuller. I believe that honest dialogue between the generations, and I'm sure that this is the keynote of this meeting, will contribute not only to the cohesion of our societies, but also to the formulation and implementation of better public policies. I'm also grateful to have been asked to discuss human rights in Latin America, because this topic is a common thread in my biography as a woman, as a political actor, and also having also the possibility to lead two different United Nations agencies. But let me talk about my experience a bit. When I was a medical student back in the 70s, I was very active in politics. At school as well, but not with a position, but I was very active, interested in knowing what's happening in the world, in the country, etc. But probably the traumatic events of 1973, military coup in Chile, which resulted in the persecution and death of so many friends and comrades, that taught me some things, that because before probably many of those things, I took them for granted. But then I learned how important they were and what happens when we lack of those important issues. First, that respect for human dignity must come before all political differences. Second, that the institution of human rights is the unquestionable foundation on which we must build our coexistence, not just tools to further any political position or another. Also, that the defense and promotion of human rights is the basis for both democracy and the welfare of people. Because if you are in a democratic situation, human rights should be respected. But on the other hand, human rights will not be respected in a government that is not a democratic, will not be guaranteed. And also, of course, that the fight for women's equality and security is one of the first steps in ensuring the advancement of human rights. Well, since then, I would tell you that those principles and others, of course, I just mentioned a few, have guided my life as well as my professional and political actions. And I have worked in organizations for the protection and defense of children, in the promotion of the health of women and the most vulnerable, in the recognition of the role of women in the field of defense, because I was also Minister of Defense. As the first woman president in my country, I emphasize, of course, the rights of the poorest, the most vulnerable women, children, but also the elderly. And at the United Nations, I had the honor of leading first the promotion of women's rights and then the defense of human rights. So that long story has turned into a vocation that drives me to continue contributing to the expansion and defense of democracy and human rights. In this year for Chile is a very important year because we will commemorate 50 years since the coup d'etat. And one of the things we are really think is key in the debate, in the national debate, is the importance of democracy and human rights in terms of lessons learned, but not only trying only to remember the past, but also to ensure that we can guarantee for every citizen all the rights, political and civil, but also social, economical rights and environmental rights, and all the other more frontier issues like technology and human rights, but also how we ensure that a good democracy, a transparent and adequate democracy. Over the years, we have seen significant progress in the protection of human rights, but also unjustifiable delays and more recently, new challenges that should alert us. I know that this panorama is not only in Latin America, we can see those in various continents. And I know that, but today I would like to focus on Latin America, which is a subject that unites and inspires us. In recent decades, Latin America has experienced important advances in human rights. Many countries in the region have implemented policies and measures to ensure the protection and respect for their citizens' fundamental rights. Among the most notable achievements are the establishment of national human rights organization, the ratification of international treaties, the adoption of laws protecting the rights of groups such as women, children, ethnic minorities, among many others. These steps forward in human rights have been favored by strengthening democratic institutionality in the region. Democratic institutionality allows civil society to participate in decision-making, political and civil rights to be respected, and the independence of the judiciary to be guaranteed. Indeed, the advancement of human rights in Latin America is closely related to the strengthening of democratic institutionality in the region. But because I'm saying there have been advances compared to the past, but of course, there's a lot of delays and there's a lot of issues that needs to be solved and needs to be done. There are still many pending issues for different vulnerable groups. And when I'm talking about vulnerable, I'm not saying that they are intrinsically vulnerable, because women are not intrinsically vulnerable, but because they usually have less access to services, to their different needs or barriers to access to education, healthcare, equal employment, and political representation, they become more vulnerable. Children are vulnerable to rights violation, including child labor, poverty, and domestic violence. Indigenous peoples often face discrimination and marginalization in access to essential services and exploitation of land and natural resources. Prisoners and the elderly also face challenges in guaranteeing their human rights when inhumane prison conditions and a lack of adequate medical care and services for the elderly. These issues require urgent attention by governments and society, in general, to ensure that all community members' human rights are respected and protected. And one thing that I would say probably has always been the same, but I think the pandemic made it more clear, is the interconnectivity between different factors. Because it's not the same in Latin America to be a woman who is a student at university or a professional or had a good job, that it has, even if she's old, than an old woman poor living in a rural area or part of an indigenous community. So I'm telling you this because usually when people develop public policies, tends to look at groups as if they're homogeneous, and we are not homogeneous. And some people have themselves 3 or 4 or 5 factors. There are other factors that are also makes people more vulnerable or with less access many times to different issues are people living with disability, and of course, migrants. And one other thing I want to say is that when you look at countries, even the countries who are supposed to have very good statistics, they can have the number of women, they can have the number of old people, maybe they can have the statistic of indigenous or rural people, but usually they don't have the connection. So many times, one of my concerns is that public policies are not targeting the ones who need the most. And probably we're leaving people behind because the majority of the country don't have those data that could ensure that you're really putting your emphasis and efforts on those who need more. So then we continue leaving people behind. And the pandemic made those two very clear. It also laid bare, of course, these inequalities between countries and inside countries as well. Besides, I think of these things that I already mentioned, new realities challenge human rights respect. They require new political will and agreements to address them, as well as the strengthening and updating institutions established to promote human rights. Well, the first challenge that everybody speaks about, and I think it's one very important challenge, is climate change. But we are not speaking, I mean, in the UN, when I was there until September last year, we started speaking only about climate change because we realized that there is a triple planetary crisis that added to climate change. It's pollution, that in some countries is really a term of reality. And secondly, or third, the loss of biodiversity. So three threats and realities. In some places, it's not a threat. If it's a threat, it's already a reality. It's probably one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing today. It will mean threats to the lives of many and significant burdens and sacrifices to cope with it, such as drought, famine, forced displacement, and loss of livelihoods. Droughts are becoming more frequent and prolonged, affecting water availability and food production, and this in turn leads to food insecurity, famine, malnutrition, etc. And of course, it always affects the poorest, the most rural, the most marginalized populations. In addition, people are forced to leave their homes due to water and food shortages, leading to massive displacement and socioeconomic conflict. One of the things that I learned is that during those massive groups of people trying to go to the Mexican frontier from Central America to go into the US, is that there was also a something due to climate change that was affecting the coffee plantation. So many people who live working on the coffee plantation could not work anymore. They lost their livelihood. So they had to migrate because they didn't have how to have a decent life. And of course, also, I would say it leads to massive displacement, but also to socioeconomic conflict. And also many communities are forced to adapt to new forms of subsistence due to environmental degradation and declining biodiversity. And in many countries of Latin America, we have seen incredible floods in the past, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Ecuador, and all these last days we're looking at it in Peru and in Lima. It's true that some people say, look, in this time of the year, we always have had these kind of things. But what climate change, I would say, adds to all of this is the violence and the periodicity of all these terrible disasters. So we must ensure that we deploy all means to alleviate the threats and to distribute equitably the sacrifices and efforts we will have to make to face the difficulty. I mentioned the first challenge is the triple planetary crisis. The second major challenge is migration, whether for economic, political, or environmental reasons, or in some cases due to conflict, or other reasons that I already mentioned. And this is a global challenge, but it manifests itself in Latin America through family separations, discrimination, labor exploitation, a lack of access to basic services such as health and education, and a lack of adequate migration and policy. One of the things that we also see the most is many women and with family who migrate, they are also affected because of all of this. But also in Latin America, we have another problem that affects mainly women, not only migrants, and that is the high levels of informal work. So those people, when you have, for example, pandemia, and the government decides to make some social protection schemes or subsidies, etc., they are not beneficiaries because they're not in the official workplace. And I think this is a real problem in Latin America. The numbers of informal workers, the majority of whom are women. And I'm talking not only on migrants, also non-migrants. We have seen all over the world, maybe in our region it's not that clear now, the relationship, but in the past it was, between conflict, climate change, poverty, and migration. In a context of global challenges, many people feel threatened and turn to justify prejudice and nationalism, denying the most basic rights to those who come from the other side of the borders. This sheds light on a very important aspect of the defense of human rights. Political and legal institutions are key to this defense, but they are not enough. Cultural work is required to expand tolerance, respect for diversity, and recognition of the dignity that exists in every human being. The third challenge is even more recent and very worrying. I'm referring to the decline of support for democracy and the increase in demand for authoritarian resolutions that several societies are experiencing. In the medium term, this poses a direct threat to the validity of human rights. Some may feel that respect for the rights of minorities, opponents, or people from other cultures or ways of life is an obstacle to ensuring the order of society and the safety of people, and prefer leaders who are willing to disrespect these rights and act in an authoritarian manner. This also comes when we are dealing with security issue, with delinquency and security issue. And we see that many countries have decided to do things their own way, like in Salvador, where they're putting into prison 50,000 young people accused of being part of the Maras. So many times when people are facing huge problems that don't have easy solutions, people tend to look at authoritarian or repressive ways to solve it because they feel insecure, they are scared, and they think that these things solve the problems. But of course, this issue of political or democracy a little bit more fragile. I would like to say that following the 6th of January attack on Capitol Hill by President Trump's supporters, Brazil this year, after President Lula took office I think it was on the 8th of January, Bolsonaristas attacked the government building, parliament, and the Supreme Court of Justice. So this is something that we might not see in every country, but really is a threat to feel that you don't respect the rules of democracy, you don't respect what people decided during votation, and decide to go through these ways to try to put their own vision, their own, I would say, way of looking at things in the country. This last challenge, all this political, authoritarian, etc., indicates that we need to strengthen the capacity of our political systems to democratically guarantee security, well-being, and social cohesion to provide a solid foundation for the respect of human rights. As you can see from this brief review, the main challenge we face in strengthening the recognition and defense of human rights is political in a profound sense. We need to improve the capacity for agreement and the will for changing political actors in order to update the institutions of democracy and human rights. We also need to expand the civic culture to defeat prejudices against others who are different and to strengthen the acceptance of diversity. I would like to conclude by pointing out something that I believe is especially important for our continent and for the progressive world to which I belong. In the face of new social fears and threats to security and well-being, we cannot assume or guarantee that majorities will support the changes required to maintain the value of democracy and the validity of human rights. And that is something we must build and conquer. For this, we need a greater sense of unity in our sector beyond minor disagreement and sometimes unimportant differences. And we must reconnect with society's new fears and desires in a humble manner. In short, promoting and defending human rights requires political renewal. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senora Bachelet, for your inspired keynote speech. Because of time constraint of our key speaker, she will not take a question for the floor, but I have 3 written questions that I would like to put to you if you have the time to answer, and I think it will reflect many of the questions that the audience would want to ask you. Can I ask you these 3 questions?
Yes, of course, go ahead.
Okay. The first one is, what good practice on the defense and promotion of human rights in Latin American countries do you consider worth highlighting and replicating?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to speak about Chile because otherwise you're going to say that of course, I'm going to speak about Chile. So I will mention examples from other parts of Latin America. I think there has been I want to highlight the creation of autonomous organizations responsible for the promotion and the protection of human rights. For example, National Human Rights Commission in Mexico or the Ombudsman's Office in Peru. But I would say all the countries from the region, from Mexico to Chile, they all have either National Human Rights Commission, either Ombudsman or Defensor del Pueblo, different, if I would say, people or structures who work and trying to respect, promote human rights, work with governments, work with municipalities to ensure that the respect, the promotion and protection of human rights is a reality. The inclusion, for example, of human rights in the Constitution and the promotion of their respect and protection through public policy and social programs, as in the case of Brazil and its Bolsa Familia program. The fight against impunity and the promotion of justice in case of human rights violations, to the creation of truth commissions and effective trials and conviction. I would say this is the case of Chile, but also in the case of Argentina and its trial of those responsible for the dictatorship's crimes. The promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous people through policies of inclusion and participation in decision-making, as in the case of Bolivia, for example, and its recognition of the rights of Mother Earth and indigenous people. The fight against discrimination and the promotion of gender equality through public policies and social programs that seek to close the inequality gap, as in the case of Uruguay and its integral law for transgender people. We could continue mentioning, but I would say there has been some very important issues that have been done. But having said that, I have to say that as important as the laws, as the public policies, it's important the real implementation. Because some countries, sometimes they do have fantastic laws, but the reality is not the same. And the other thing that I think is important and needed is to always be analyzing what it was thought it could work well, if it did work well. For example, being in the Office of the High Commissioner with Mexico, we did an analysis of the protection system for human rights defenders. And we identified 120 points that needed to be improved. And we gave that assessment to the government, and the government, I suppose, took many of those things in consideration. So I think there's no process that is perfect. There are good practices that needs to be assessed frequently and to continue improving. But I guess one thing that it has happened in some countries is that I think we should include, because one of the more important things of people who work with human rights, being it women's rights organization, LGBTI rights organization, indigenous group, is that people be aware of their rights so they can ask for them or demand them. And I think it would be very important if we could, in many countries, have a curriculum at school of human rights. So children learn since they're very small what their rights are, and so they can organize themselves in the future and demand them.
The second question put by the public is the following. Latin American countries have had armed conflicts not so recently, and they have multiple paths to achieving peace. In what way do you consider that these paths are consistent or not with the postulates of the Inter-American human rights system?
Well, I think the Latin American countries have taken different paths to achieve peace. And some of them may be, and some may not be consistent with the tenets of the Inter-American human rights system, depending on how human rights are implemented and respected in each particular case. There have been people who remember the false positives in Colombia. I mean, there's many examples where things were done well, but in many others, there were real violations of human rights. So I think the Inter-American human rights system seeks to protect and promote human rights and democracy in the Americas. So that's why they have the commission. The commissioners are following each country. The human rights national commissions are following each country. As a high commissioner, we used to have, as a Latin American, of course, to have meetings with all the national commissions of human rights, the whole countries in Latin America. And we were analyzing the progress, but also what needed to be advanced much more. So I think this is something, again, that needs to be always be supervised, if I may say, monitor and identifying when it's not exactly according to the tenets of the Inter-American human rights system. But also member states, including Latin American countries, have a responsibility to comply with the international commitment they have made to respect and protect the human rights of all persons within the borders. Every country who has signed a covenant or a treaty on human rights, it's not just that he can respect it if he wants. They have a legally bonding responsibility with that. And that's why they have to go to the High Commission, present reports, and the High Commissioner's Office presents report on all of these countries when there are resolutions of the Human Rights Council on that regard. And many of our countries in Latin America have gone through this process and continue every year or every 6 months, depending on the gravity of the situation. They have to, the Office of Commissioner or the Special Rapporteur presents a report, and the government has to respond and have to show afterwards what it's doing to solve this problem. Some of the paths that have been taken to achieve peace include negotiating peace agreements with armed groups, transitional justice, national reconciliation, and strengthening democratic institutions. And if they are implemented in a manner that respects and protects human rights of all persons involved, including victims of human rights violations and their families, this path could be consistent with the tenets of the Inter-American human rights system. However, if the path to involve human rights violation, impunity for the perpetrators of these violations, if there's lack of reparation for the victims, or there is a weakening of democratic institutions, then probably path will be much more inconsistent with the tenets of the Inter-American human rights system. One government decided that to close or to fire, I don't know what the word exactly legal word is, a lot of people from the judiciary system, because they said that they were corrupted, that they defended only the rich. When the poor people rob something, they will always go to jail, but in the big guys who rob a lot, never. And I said to the minister who explained to me this, I said, yes, maybe your intention is good, but that's not the way of doing it. So it's not only about the intention, but the implementation and how you really respect certain principle is key. And I would say there's no something that you could say 100% does it good, 100% does it bad. No, we have examples of I would say, good practices and not so good practices.
The third written question I have is the following. Do you have any message for the leaders of Latin America in terms of the defense of human rights in the region?
Well, I think it's essential to strengthen the commitment and action to protect human rights in all their dimensions in the region. Because as High Commissioner, I heard a lot of complaints from institutions in almost a dozen countries in the region that testify to the trend and magnitude of the problem faced by human rights organizations, of also limited civic space. Because the reason in many countries was like the pandemic. But of course, but as I said in the past, you can, of course, limit mobility. You can take, because there is a health catastrophe, a lot of measures that are needed from the sanitary point of view, from the health point of view, that I agree with them. I'm a medical doctor. But there's no excuse to limit free speech, freedom of expression, or to repress the press, for example. And we saw in some countries in Latin America during the pandemic to use the excuse of the pandemic to limit civic space and some liberties. And those are liberties that do not have any relationship with the management of the pandemic. So I would say that, so I believe that it's essential to protect fourth generation human rights, such as the right to a healthy environment and non-discrimination against minorities. In addition, it's important, as I already said, to ensure freedom of expression and prevent violence and arbitrary detentions. Discrimination and violence against minorities and gender-based violence are persistent problems that must be addressed with concrete and effective measures as well. And it's also crucial to strengthen democratic institutions and ensure that political leaders and governments respect all people's human rights and fundamental freedoms without exception. And as I said at the beginning of our conversation, without democracy, there are no human rights. So we need to protect human rights, but we also need to strengthen democracy in all of our countries. Thank you.
I have just received a fourth question from the audience. Do you have the time to answer it?
Yes, I think I do.
Okay, I'm going to read it to you.
Okay, if you have any questions.
It's from an anonymous attendee, and it's as follows.
We have a lot of questions, but I think in terms of the time, we're going to receive a couple of them.
Just, yeah, I would read this one.
If you please come forward the microphone.
I think the question is.
Sorry.
The question is over there.
Yeah.
Let me check right away.
I would like to know more about your point of view on the procedures done in El Salvador regarding Los Maras. There is a lot of resistance and critiques coming from the UN and human rights organizations. But it is true what Bukele said. Where were these organizations when the Maras were killing thousands of innocent Salvadorian families? So I ask, in what way is it authoritarian? Should they be given other special treatment in prison? They were showing that the prisoners were not working in several local tasks, construction, cleaning, etc. I personally don't have a decision because I also put myself in the shoes of the Salvadorians that are happy that finally there are no more Maras on the street. What would be an ideal approach there? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that question, even though I have to say, I don't have also a final, I mean, I have contradictions on this behalf, to be completely honest. I have known the case of the Maras, how the young people to be part of the Mara have to kill somebody. I knew a young student, those guys who go there from Techo para Chile, went there to build houses for the poorest in El Salvador. And one young guy who wanted to be part of the Mara just killed him while he was walking in the street because he needed to do that. So I know all the terrible things that the Maras have done. The problem is that I mean, what many families says, I don't have the evidence on that, but many families says that some of the young people who were put into prison were not from the Maras. But just because they were poor, they were suspicious, and they just took it without due process and without enough evidence. And then the prisons are really overcrowded. I know that now they built a bigger prison, like 45,000 or something. But the problem is that, and on the other hand, it looks like, I mean, I'm talking about official numbers, so I don't know the reality, that it has been effective in terms of bringing back down the number of homicides. The official numbers speak about 80% of homicide have gone down in a month. I'm not sure those numbers, do they really represent the reality? Are there other numbers? I'm not sure. So I think this will always be a conflict. Because as I said before, sometimes people, when they see a delinquent who does something that is not adequate or correct or clearly kill somebody, if I would say the emotional response with, oh, and I see it in the television, he has to be killed, he has to be given jail for life, etc., etc. And I, for example, when a little girl has been raped and killed, and the parents, of course, they're going to react saying, we want him to be killed. I'm against the death penalty, but anyway, I do believe that there is an issue, because it's clear that it's probably sure, I don't have the evidence, I insist, that some of these young people may not have been maras and have been put into jail because they were suspicious. There has not been an adequate investigation and so on. So if that's true, well, that is a big violation. On the other hand, if the maras are in prison in good, normal conditions, because of course, usually prisons are bad for everyone and overcrowded and in bad shape everywhere, at least that they have a due process. So if they're innocent, they can defend themselves. But it's a very complicated situation for people who work in human rights, because clearly it doesn't seem like the way that you just go in the streets and take everybody into jail because they're suspicious, because you know what will happen, that usually the poorest are going to go, the ones who are going to go inside the jail. And maybe they are, and maybe they're not part of those organizations. So it's very complicated, but I've been discussing this issue with many of our colleagues on human rights here. And I understand the person who made the question, because it looks like it was effective if the numbers are real. It looks like it was effective. So the problem is that when something is effective, how you avoid the tendency to do things that violate human rights. Because I remember I used to work as an epidemiologist in the AIDS Commission in Chile. And some people would say, oh, all the people who are living with AIDS should be put in the island in the most southern part of Chile, so they're not at risk of anyone. Those are the kind of solutions that I don't think are good, because maybe you can have solutions soon. It's like trying to go against migrants, because when people are desperate, they do what they want to do, but they're going to do it in the most riskier ways. People will continue to migrate or to look for refugees. But if you don't have a good solution to it, they will not do it through the regular path. They're going to do it through very difficult. You have seen this. We have seen it.
Thank you very much. This is all we have time this evening. So the only thing that is left is to give Michelle Bachelet a big round of applause.
Yes.
And thank her for her very illuminating speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Very
Yes.
nice to be with you and with the students.
Yeah, thank you. It was an honor to have you here. It was inspiring not only as students, but also as Latin Americans, as future young leaders, to hear you tonight. It was very inspiring. We got a lot of things to learn from this conference. And thank you very much also to Francisco to join us as chair. And this is the first Latin American summit that we are hosting here at LSE. So we hope that with his successful day and with successful week, we're going to repeat this in the coming years. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for joining us, and follow us on Instagram.
Can I tell you a last thing?
For sure, for sure.
Please don't give up. Sometimes things don't work the way you want. If you want to go into politics or internal relationship, but don't give up. And because there are bad moments in the history of the world, and to these moments is not the best one, but please never lose hope, never lose your values, your principles, and be, as Desmond Tutu used to tell me, a prisoner of hope. Because in that way, you don't give up and you continue doing what you think you need to do to improve your countries or the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So with this amazing closing of this day that was very successful, we are so happy. We invite you to follow us on Instagram, because we have more activities tomorrow and also on Friday. And we are closing this Latin American week on Friday at Downstairs Mestizo with a big party, Latin American party. So we invite you everyone to buy your tickets before it's sold out. So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much.
Gracias a ti. Chao.